Hi, Connor Curtis here with the Environment in Canada podcast and Sierra Club Canada. Just jumping in before your podcast begins today to mention that we're currently conducting a communication survey of our listeners and supporters. So if you're a regular listener to the podcast or you know about Sierra Club Canada or the Environment in Canada podcast from other places, please take a second to go fill out that survey. It's at the link in the description and let us know what you think.
Fashion plays a role with climate change, and they can speak really well to that dynamic. And then I can work really well with the curators of minerals and talk about how minerals are needed for critical minerals and kind of set that wheel going in a different direction. And then I can speak with the paleontologists about how mass extinctions are associated with climate change and then set that going in a different direction. So it's kind of this shotgun approach of many fronts, and like almost every curator at the museum has something they can say from their own grounding as experts that pertains to the climate crisis. Job, I feel, can just be shining a mirror almost on society and saying, like, look at this cool thing that's happening. Like, you phased out coal, like maybe you'd forgotten that. Let's look at that and, celebrate that, and so that more people can do things like that.
Welcome to another episode of the Environment in Canada podcast, a podcast about the environment in Canada by Sierra Club Canada. I'm Jessica Murray, and I'm a community organizer with Sierra Club Canada based out of the Dinadane or Guelph, Ontario. To learn more about my activities, follow us at Sierra Club Ontario on Instagram or head over to nline5.ca to join the movement to safeguard the largest freshwater source on our planet, our beloved Great Lakes. You can also connect with me every other week on Zoom, where I co-host a 1-hour community of practice that engages the emotional soul work of climate activism through group work. These sessions explore the work of Joanna Macy, known as The Work That Reconnects, and Vanessa Machado de Oliveira, and her books Hospicing and Outgrowing Modernity. Feel free to reach out anytime. Jessica M. at sierraclub.ca. Today, I'm speaking with Dr. Soren Brothers, who I recently sat on a panel with after we co-presented the film Climate in Therapy at the Planet in Focus Festival in Toronto. The documentary follows 7 climate scientists as they undergo group therapy together and wrestle with the emotions underlying their work. Dr. Soren Brothers is the Allan and Helaine Shiff Curator of Climate Change at the Royal Ontario Museum. He is also an assistant professor at the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at the University of Toronto. His research examines the effects of climate change on lakes and how changes in aquatic systems can influence their greenhouse gas emissions to the atmosphere. Today, we'll debrief and reflect on the film and explore the meaning of emotional work as we meet the multi-layered and complex polycrises of our times. Before we begin, just a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca. We have tons of petitions, other actions and events, and regular news updates you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on the Harbinger Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, YouTube, or wherever else you can get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM, bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe so you can get the latest episodes from us. Hi, good morning, Soren. It's so nice to see you again. How are you doing this morning?
Great. How are you?
I'm good. Yeah, it's nice to be able to do this just a mere, 2 days after we first met at Planet in Focus Festival. We co-presented between the ROM and Sierra Club Canada the film Climate in Therapy. And yeah, because the panel afterwards was a mere 15-20 minutes, I thought it would be much more interesting to be able to just organically debrief together and then share that with our listeners.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I think that's a great idea.
So before we kind of dive into it, I wonder if you want to share an introduction about yourself. And through this introduction, I guess I would invite you to interpret it how you will, because in the film, there was this moment where as they were being asked questions, the climate scientists were kind of like, do I answer this as a climate scientist or a human? And so I will let you decide whether you are a human, Soren the human this morning, or whether you feel more like Soren the climate scientist this morning, or both.
We can talk about that. I mean, I think that's one of the interesting aspects of that film was that there is that divide presented too. But yeah, my name is Soren Brothers. I'm the Allan and Helaine Shiff Curator of Climate Change at the Royal Ontario Museum. My background is studying lakes, mostly looking at greenhouse gas emissions from lakes and how lakes respond to climate change and humans. And so, yeah, at the museum, I'm in research slash exhibitions and public community, multifaceted kind of position. So it's pretty exciting, and it was a good fit for this film. And I'm speaking as a human.
I mean, I still am like super curious about your work, both your findings as well as like how you translate that into a curated experience at the ROM. I have little ones. I used to live in Toronto, so I took my kids to the ROM, but I can't say I remember like a specific section that was like, this is the part about climate change, or whether it's more like integrated into all of the exhibits. And yeah, I'm curious if you could speak to that.
Yeah, so when I started working at the museum, I mean, there had been climate change exhibitions. There's no climate specific gallery. And that's definitely, I mean, one of the things that has come up in conversations. And I think it's interesting. Like there are some museums like the American Museum of Natural History, Australian Museum in Sydney, like they have kind of dedicated climate spaces. I think both given recognition that it takes time if you really want to like build something like that into an institution that's already full to the rafters, and it's like hard to get even like a case, let alone like having building a whole new gallery like that. The latest gallery that opened at the museum, I think it took 10 or 11 years of planning. So that's kind of a longer term question of how do you build that space in, and it takes over $10 million to do the work to build that kind of space. In the meantime, approach that I've had, given that we don't have forever with climate change, is thinking about like how do I make this museum as it is a harmonized climate change instrument of education. And I kind of wonder, I mean, obviously I wasn't on the search committee hiring me, but part of my thinking was like, do we need another, say like a David Suzuki or Greta Thunberg, like someone who will be the climate person? Or is it even more powerful to say, like, have someone who turns this into a climate institution? It's like through elevating like the curator of fashion and how fashion plays a role with climate change, and they can speak really well to that dynamic. And then I can work really well with the curators of minerals and talk about how minerals are needed for critical minerals and kind of set that wheel going in a different direction. And then I can speak with the paleontologists about how like mass extinctions are associated with climate change and then set that going in a different direction. So it's kind of this shotgun approach of many fronts, and like almost every curator at the museum has something they can say from their own grounding as experts that pertains to the climate crisis. It kind of fits into a community approach. Like there's something I like that I've heard Catherine Hayhoe say, where I think the climate communicator you're probably aware of in Texas, she's originally from Toronto as well. Appropriate way maybe of looking at the issue right now is not that we're pushing this heavy ball up the hill and we need another David Suzuki or sort of leader to help push us, but it's actually we're at the top of the hill and it's starting to go down and we need more community support to accelerate it. But it's like, this is the moment to really just have like an upwelling rather than like one person that's trying to say that they're going to fix the problem in a
Yeah.
way.
Yeah, because it's not like a one person that can fix it, right? It's like an
Yeah.
all of us issue, isn't it?
And there's so much happening right now that I feel maybe 10 years ago I couldn't have done this, but right now a lot of the job I feel can just be shining a mirror almost on society and saying like, look at this cool thing that's happening. Like you phased out coal, like maybe you'd forgotten that. Let's look at that and celebrate that, and so that more people can do things like that.
I love that. Thank you. I'm just remembering something that you said on the panel. I remember you saying on the panel that when you were thinking about curating these spaces, that you didn't want it to just be all doom and gloom. Yeah, I'm curious to know, I guess, like currently at the ROM, what storying or like what narrative is alive, and or just even like one exhibit maybe that like is really exciting you, or like I'm curious to know how you like tell the story of this with
Yeah.
the context of not wanting it to only be doom and gloom or
It's tricky because, one of the first things I did was set up working with the learning team and docents, the people who give tours of the museum, set up a climate change tour. And just last week, actually, one of them was saying that, they try and do a message that's not doom and gloom, and they actually get pushback, especially from students who are like, you're sugarcoating it, we want the real deal, stop lying to us. And it's like they're pushing them to be more apocalyptic in the messaging. It's just kind of interesting. But I feel like, speaking to other communicators, they see, like, depending on who you're engaging with, some people respond to that. Some people respond more to optimistic messaging. Like, some people are overwhelmed with eco-anxiety and they can't deal hearing about how bad it is. And it's almost like, for me, it's like, there's not like necessarily a wrong way to communicate climate change. I think you engage with different people in different ways, depending where they are. But I see it kind of as like there's a carrot and there's a stick. And we've been really focusing on the stick approach of like, we're not doing enough because you're not scared enough of climate change. And I think the flip side of that is I started realizing that there's a lot of people who are more scared of climate solutions than they are of climate change. Like, they're more scared about what it means to be a net zero city and what that's going to take away from their quality of life. And that's why it's like almost no matter how scared some messaging might try and make them about the potential consequences of climate change, it seems like the consequences of a climate solution are more real to them. So that's where I'm trying to focus, at least on filling that gap of like, well, let's talk about what climate solutions are and maybe like think about the benefits that they provide to our kids' lung health and mental health and access to clean water. Like, my daughters would love to go swimming in the Don. And it's like, when I was a kid, I couldn't do that. But now we're getting to a point where that's kind of possible. And it's going to become easier and easier in the coming years. So it's like, those are things where, I have to walk a fine line to not say like, okay, because we phased out coal in Ontario, or because we're introducing, protected bike lanes and these kinds of things, we haven't solved the global climate crisis. But these are things that we have to do on that road, and they're not scary. They're actually improving our quality of life, regardless of our political space on the spectrum. So that's kind of where, from a messaging perspective, I've been focusing. And we just opened an exhibition that I curated on Crawford Lake. It was like a local lake that was selected as the golden spike of the proposed Anthropocene epoch. And we tried to really kind of wrap that into some of this message of like how humans relate to the environment, and disassociating from this idea that relationship has to be a negative one. Like, humans can relate positively with the environment, and that's actually kind of a starting point for a lot of cultures in the world, particularly Indigenous cultures. And so we should recognize that our knee-jerk reaction that a human impact is a negative one is culturally grounded, and we can be critical of it.
As you were speaking, lots of ideas came up. So I'm just like, putting down little things. But I heard you say the word Anthropocene epoch. That's actually 2 words. And just in case there are any of our listeners that are like, I don't know what that means. That sounds very, very scientific. Could you just give us a definition of what that is?
Yeah, for sure. And thanks for catching that. So the idea of an Anthropocene epoch is basically, it's almost science fiction. It's like asking a question, if you were to go a million years in the future and there was a geologist still around at that point, and they were to look back through the history of the planet, would they look at the time today and say, in the geological record, there was a shift, like there was a change in the planet, and it was associated with human activities? The argument that some geologists and some scientists are saying that we have created like a whole shift in the planetary system that's going to be global and in the record geologically now. And so there was a proposal that went forward, part of, I guess, and I kind of learned this as it was coming up. For geologists, part of the way that they organize history is, if they have a time that's been measured or defined, like between whatever the Paleocene and the Eocene epochs or periods, they have what's called a golden spike. So it's the place on the planet that shows it the best. And there'll be actually a brass spike, like in a hillside in China or in Italy somewhere, that says this is the best place to show where the Paleocene became the Eocene. So the question was, if we're going to have a new epoch that we're going to call the Anthropocene, what would be the best place on the planet to show and to give evidence for that? And they selected Crawford Lake, which is like around Milton, Ontario.
Fascinating. Why Crawford Lake of all places? Like, on the entire planet chose Crawford.
Yeah, so there's 12, a short list of 12 sites globally, and Crawford Lake was voted as the best golden spike. And so that's what the exhibition is answering. It's like, yeah, everyone is like, why? Like, what's so special about Southern Ontario, this like tiny lake you can walk around in half an hour? To me, it's like, there's a really interesting history in Crawford Lake that goes beyond just that Anthropocene golden spike, but that was where like it was on the headlines of New York Times and all these newspapers around the world when that was announced a couple of years ago.
Okay, and I'm guessing maybe you want to not explain it to us so people will go see these. What is it?
Well,
Like 30 minutes from my house.
yeah, I mean, it's not that I don't want to explain. I just didn't know if you wanted to take over the podcast.
Would that take podcast?
Yeah,
What about a snack size, high level?
sure. Yeah.
Little
I mean, I think that the things that are really special about Crawford Lake, to me at least, I think there's three factors that really kind of made it stick out globally. One is that it's right on the top of, it's like perched on the top of the Niagara Escarpment. So I don't know if anyone's familiar with when you're driving west on the 401, there's that point where you kind of climb the escarpment. It's right there. Like if you turn off there, you're right there. And that kind of geology, like the lake is over what was a cave that had caved in at some point in history. So it's really, really deep just in that landscape. And so it never mixes. So it creates a condition that's really good for capturing and storing information of the environment, that whatever like pollen falls in the lake or animals die there. The second thing is that you have 55 years of research that people have done on it, actually starting with the Ron Curator in 1970, who started taking sediment cores, like taking mud out of the lake to study the history of the environment. His student, Maria Boyko, found corn pollen, which from the 1280s that indicated indigenous farming at the time. And so then they started opening up archaeological work and they partially reconstructed the village that was there. And so there was this kind of human land use, environmental interaction history. And then you have a place that stores information really well. You have people who have been recording and translating that information into writing. And then you have a really interesting story to tell. Like there's been like a millennium of human activity, that's indigenous activity, settler activity, that there's global activity. You have records of plutonium from nuclear weapons testings
in that lake.
around the world. And yeah, so it captures this really kind of neat story that there's science telling it and there's a good geology to support that. So it's those three things together that I think made like Crawford Lake really stick out globally.
I love that. That makes me actually want to go visit it, like this afternoon, maybe. Is it?
Yeah, the boardwalk is currently under construction. So I don't know if I don't. Well, yeah, I might double check before going if you wanted to walk around it. The village site would be accessible though, and it's beautiful. And you have the long houses.
Thanks for sharing that with me. Okay, I also caught one other thing that I wanted to bring back because you talked about how some of the youth, and so when you said youth that went in and they were like, this is just sugarcoating it, what age group are you talking about? Are they like university or college age, or are they still in high school? I'm just curious.
I mean, this was coming to me secondhand from one of the docents giving the climate change tours. My understanding, I think he said that they were probably university age, sort of maybe early 20s, late teens.
Yeah, I find it really interesting to stay close to those younger generations that are processing this in their own kind of generational way. And yeah, so interestingly, a question that comes up when I'm listening to you is fear still useful? And I kind of, because you also bring in this, your daughter, and I have kids too, and it very much drove me like getting into the work that I'm in as well. So it's almost like I think about how in parenting there is this shift. I know this is like kind of a stretch, or a bit of an adjacent thought, but I think there are some ways of thinking about parenting now that we're like kind of aware that using shame and making people feel bad, like it doesn't actually get you where the behavior you want your kid to be at anyways. And I wonder if there's an interesting parallel here where it's like we're using these old ways of like fear tactics to then try to get a behavior that's not happening. And so there's like a question there for me of like, how do we stay honest to what's happening, but also be aware of whether we're trying to manipulate fear to get an outcome result? And what else, I guess, could be motivating? And you've kind of alluded to some of them, like talking about how connecting to these new green technology or new ways of being that actually could enhance our life on Earth, regardless of whether this unraveling continues, that life could actually still improve. So I wanted to name that and see if anything comes up as I share that.
Totally know what you mean. So I mean, my daughters are 2 and 4, so it's been too young to have that conversation yet. But
Give it a year. My kids are 5, so
yeah,
happens
it'll
fast.
happen. I'm ready for it. kind of, or maybe I'm not ready for it, but I'd like to think I'll be ready for it by the time it comes. I totally know what you mean. I think that the kind of the guilt-based and fear-based pushing for climate communications, again, I don't know if I'd say it's wrong, but it's definitely not the only strategy that we should have in our toolkit. I think that like oil executives should feel guilty for stuff they're doing, but not necessarily someone who is like a overtired parent who left the light on by accident to the basement, or like their kid. It's like those things are small potatoes. I mean, one of the things that I try and like, I remember actually when I got hired in this job, there was this kind of funny moment where everyone was, I feel like, on eggshells around me. And there was this concern that I was going to be like the climate monk coming in and like, if they had a disposable coffee cup, it was like, oh my God, like they were hiding it. And people were apologizing if they drove into work because they're like, well, sorry, I would normally ride the bike, but it was my bike was like the tire was out. And I was like, I'm not here to like judge you. But it was funny that was what people's expectation was of me. And then it kind of, as they got to know me, they saw that wasn't. I think there's bigger things we have to focus on and get behind, which is like cleaning our air quality by phasing out coal and fossil fuels. And those are things that are shared across the system. And those are like the majority of the problem rather than these like little individual behavioral shifts. And so I think that, and I think it's worth remembering that, the whole idea of personal carbon footprints was a PR campaign by British Petroleum to put that on the consumer and to not have any, for them to be able to kind of stay in the shadows and keep on doing what they're doing. So yeah, in general, I recognize that there can be, focusing on the individual things people can do. I'm eager to tap into that when there's an element of empowerment to it. Like for kids that can't vote yet, like feeling that they can do something is great. And those things do matter. But I'm also more keen to try and get public support for large scale, like carbon neutral programs and things like that. And just seeing that those are things that, regardless of our political spectrum space, there's shared values at making the streets safer for our kids and making our health improved, all that kind of stuff.
You're really touching on a very systemic knot, and I actually want to like gently challenge you on this idea that people that work in fossil fuels, like let's say the CEO of Enbridge, should feel guilty. Like I think there's like an element of, yeah, like don't deny those feelings. Like if you were really living, and I mean like this also starts to touch on things like different worldviews and belief systems and whose version of truth is right. It gets very, very, very mucky. But I want to kind of almost like suggest that this is like such a systemic issue that even if that CEO stepped down and a new one stepped in and they had some sort of hope for, some sort of greening element, they would still succumb to the system, which I think is tied in with capitalism and the history of so-called Canada. All of that is kind of enmeshed all in one. And so I guess like I'm left at a question of like, how do we change the system when the power is so fundamentally tied to our history of capitalism, of colonialism, of extraction? And that's like I don't even like expect you to have an answer because I think this is like the question we are actually asking underneath it all. And that none of us individually has an answer for this, but maybe you do. I don't know.
No, well, I mean, I think it's a fair question. I mean, I think there's a systemic issue. I feel that more and more we're also though seeing that there's an element of deception that's come from oil companies where it's like
Yeah.
they have worked actively and still put a certain amount of money into something that looks like a green initiative, and then they'll put orders of magnitude more amount of money into press campaigns that go against it. I think there is a history of manipulating public opinions to support their capital gains. So it's like, yes, you could say that the next CEO might also try and do that, but they don't have to. That's a choice that they're making. You can have good leadership that would transition these companies into modes of working that are not going to negatively impact society and the structure. That system could also be something that people hide behind. But I mean, going back to the movie that we saw the other day, it occurred to me afterwards, it would be interesting to see group therapy for a bunch of corporate executives that are in that business versus climate scientists, where like these are people who are probably doing this work because they're already concerned about the environment and about people and how they're going to be impacted by it. And they're already struggling with those emotions. But I'd be curious to see how, if people who are actively pushing for the potential furthering of it or benefiting financially from the climate crisis, how does that, what kind of emotions do they have potentially bottled up? And would they be comfortable sharing them, or are there emotions there that are simmering, or is it just a denial that goes deep?
Yeah. I mean, I'd be even more curious to see a group therapy circle where it's like both climate scientists and like both of them together. Because now you have these two different worldviews probably coming up against each other and meeting one another and held in the space. So that'd be a really, really interesting project. But thank you for bringing us back to the film because I'm like, oh, like so many different places we can go
Yeah,
with
yeah,
this
yeah.
conversation. But yeah, I'm curious to know, as you were watching the film, like what was that like for you? Did you kind of feel a sort of shared identity with the climate scientists? Like they were all kind of along maybe the spectrum of like a spectrum of openness towards sharing about feelings. I did find it really interesting that it was the two Black women in that circle that first started talking about emotion. Like it's just something I noticed, and I don't know if that's like indicative of something larger or just what happened for that group. But yeah, what did you notice? What resonated for you?
I mean, my mind was going in a lot of different places. I mean, it was a really nicely put together film, and like it was engaging. I think one of the first things that, especially like afterwards, I was kind of processing was, what is the point of this? You know, like what is the point of putting a group of climate scientists under, in a documentary setting, under therapy? Like,
Mhm.
is the goal of this to show to the public that climate scientists are people too and that they have human emotions, or is it to laugh at them because it's like scientists are so like in their heads,
Mm.
and the implication is that they're not in touch with their emotions, and it would be funny to see how they're trying to have these emotions teased out. And I think there was almost elements of both of that in the way that it was filmmaker like picking out, I think, as many pieces that they could that were like scientists having struggling with ways to express their emotions. But I was also wondering, like, would it be different for another group? Like, if you were to just take 10 businessmen, would they have a similar trajectory where at first they're having a tough time expressing their emotions, and maybe some of them are being more cerebral, and then a few break down and cry? Like, I mean, for me, maybe it's because I'm too deep in with the science crowd. Like, I don't, the idea that scientists are like a different species of humans is definitely a common one, but I see a full spectrum of, like, I've seen scientists crying in conferences many times. I know some scientists that are super nerdy and have a hard time processing their emotions. And I know some musicians who are super nerdy and have a hard time processing their emotions. And I know some scientists that are like totally wild, and by night they do theater, and they're like, and by day they do science. They wear their hearts on their sleeves. I mean, so I don't, and then it's kind of a question. It's like, well, if the movie is about just getting people to understand that scientists are people, then I guess that's a good thing. But if it's to laugh at scientists and how like awkward they are, and it is what's holding us back from the climate crisis, the fact that scientists are not open enough with each other about their emotions, is like, I don't think that's
No.
a problem. I think the problem is that maybe the problem is that people think that scientists are too much the other, and that leads to distrust of science, especially amongst the people who already have like questions about climate science, if they think that scientists are just in it for the money or whatever. I don't think there's that many people who believe that, but I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's a bigger, maybe societal problem if there is something there that could have progress. But that was something where my mind was kind of going around, and it's like,
Yeah.
what is the goal here? Like, how does this film help us forward with the climate crisis, or does it, or is it just kind of to laugh at scientists and how nerdy we can be?
I think you're right. There's like a kind of like a little bit of that. And of course, it's within the framework of entertainment. And it's
Yeah,
for whatever reason, humans find it funny to watch at people when they're like kind of struggling and to make fun of these sorts of stereotypes. So there is kind of this like challenge of documentaries, even if they are documentaries and not total fictional movies. So that's important to name. And I appreciate you unflattening the reality that whatever category or identity you choose, there's a whole cosmology of diversity always.
yeah,
That's so easy to forget. The way that I saw it was actually that here are these scientists, they know the data and are so closely attuned to the data and the reality. And I guess the question there was more like, that knowing what they know, how are they feeling about it? And how would that That was a question that was left a bit unresolved, a larger question of like, what role do emotions have in climate justice work, for example? Like, how important is it? And I guess at the same time, at the end, we did see the climate scientists go through some sort of resolve where, I don't know, they lightened, It's like I feel like they maybe felt a sort of renewal. And it wasn't like, aha, now I have the thing that's going to save the world. It was more like, aha, like I am somehow like more at ease in my body with this reality and feel more connected to another, another scientist, a circle of scientists that we've had this deep experience together. And I wonder how that would affect their work. I guess like a question that I have for you connected to that is like your own, and if you can share to whatever level of comfort is available to you today, but your own personal kind of relationship to therapy, talking about emotions, again, knowing that you are one climate scientist
Yeah.
speaking for all climate scientists, but yeah, what role do emotions have for you, I guess, in how you relate to your work and that it can feel meaningful given where we are?
Yeah, I mean, I think, scientists are at our core, we're communicators. That gets easily lost. I mean, in terms of can focus on doing the work and getting data and having those numbers, but if you're not going to communicate those numbers to words in a way that people can understand, and I mean, it's like we're being hired not just by the public in terms of like public funding, not just to measure something, but to communicate it effectively so that we can learn from it and hopefully improve everyone. I think there is, and that's not to say that that comes naturally to all scientists, but it's definitely part of the work. And especially, I mean, obviously, I'm in a funny role as a museum curator and personally as a musician, where I find it very easy to speak openly, and I'm very comfortable kind of with like the performance aspect of it and in front of an audience and that kind of thing. In terms of, I mean, I've never been through therapy, but I feel like I'm kind of the only friend in my group that hasn't. Like it's something that I think is, there are probably times where I should have, but it's hard also with like moving and with different kinds of periods of life to maybe maybe I should have made more of an effort to make the space for that. I think it's a really positive thing, and I think it's important that people take active steps to come in touch with their emotions, especially if that's something that's impacting their family life or their personal life or their relationships, like all these kinds of things, let alone their professional life. I guess at the same time, like as a scientist, I remember I think when I was doing my PhD, I realized at one point that doing climate science was it was a way of coping with the terror of what was happening in a way, which was interesting to become aware of, terrified of the what's happening to the planet and the way it's warming and what it's going to do to ecosystems. But here I am studying a lake, and if I think, oh, this is cool, there's a warming experiment where we're warming this lake by 2 degrees, and what does that do for greenhouse gas emissions from the lake? Suddenly, it's like moving it from the heart to the head, and I can kind of tap into the curiosity aspect, and that becomes an emotional tool of coping with, okay, let's stop just being scared. Let's all think about this and try and understand it. And then I'm not as scared in that moment. And then still probably, maybe it's a form of repression, and maybe that's why I had so many nightmares at that time. But I wondered about, I mean, it wasn't like a nightly thing, but I mean, it was definitely, I'd wake up occasionally and be like, oh yeah, there was another climate nightmare of like hurricanes and stuff. But yeah, so I mean, I wonder if that, like when I was watching the movie, I was kind of wondering if that was something for those scientists too, where they're doing climate science as a way of coping with the fear of what's happening. And I thought it was interesting too that there was that one. I mean, I'm assuming that many of them were parents, but they really like the filmmakers, I feel like focused especially on that one guy who had like young kids who had just spoken to him about it, and he was the one that tried to make it like it was kind of nerdy and funny having this like positive graph, but I felt like that came directly with kind of going back to what you were saying earlier, like how do we speak to our kids about it and not wanting to just submit to the fear. But I was like, how much of that is him coping versus trying to make it less scary for his kids, and also like, maybe it's just too much to think about what your kids are going to have to live through if you're not focusing on that positive direction that you have to go into and the changes that we can make. So I think there's elements of all those where for me, that's probably part of it too. I mean, I feel since I've been in this role emotionally, I've been less worried about it. I mean, it's not to say that I'm at all comfortable with what's happening, but speaking about it every day, like I was actually worried when I took this job as a climate change curator that it would be bad for my mental health. I was like, this is going to be really depressing to have to talk about it every day. But I find it's almost been like a form of like public therapy, of like talking through it every day and speaking to people who are doing things every day about it and seeing like, oh, there are like this and this and this and this really cool thing that we're doing, and it's making our lives better. And my daughters are less likely to have asthma growing up than I did because of climate action that's happening and that's happened. And that is, even if we're absolutely not doing it fast enough, it's still nice to see that change. And that makes me less terrified about it and less petrified by it.
These are really interesting themes that you're bringing up because you said that in becoming a climate scientist, that it sounds like, if I got this correct, is that you felt that it kind of went from here, and I'm like kind of at my heart, and then came to your head. And this is like kind of the era that we live in, right? Where we know there's a lot of data and information about issues, and yet the data is not, at least presently, as what we've seen, is not producing the behavior that we need to actually get us out of this mess. And so I have a curiosity of what would it mean to, there's a difference between coping with our emotions and then feeling like we can do our job. And I think you and I both have picked jobs that are actually in the realm of what we really care about. And that's a real privilege and real beautiful thing. I guess I'm also curious to know, like, is there a difference between that coping? Because now I know stuff and I feel a little bit more comfortable versus feeling my way through and metabolizing those emotions so that something, I don't know, like what might come next. So I'm curious what it would mean for us to feel our way through more, not because we now have gone into our minds and feel in some sort of way like placated. Is that the right word? That now
Yeah.
we know something about this and therefore it's not kind of like if we know something, it's not something as fearful, right? Like once I know something about it, it's suddenly kind of like not as threatening. But here we have this thing where we know something more, but it actually is just as threatening in some ways, right? Depending on what level you're looking at. So yes, asthma chance is lower, but in terms of global levels of catastrophe, like I don't know, is it the same or worse? Like I think I'm not even sure how to think about these things sometimes, if I'm honest.
Yeah, no, it's tricky. I mean, and I think for me, it goes back also to something I said in that panel about this idea of like defining what a solution is and kind of setting our goals and getting clarity on that. And that was something where people talk about climate change solutions all the time. Like I was talking about them earlier, but it is once you actually try and step back and it's like, okay, what's the solution? It's like, is a bike lane a solution to climate change? Is an electric car a solution to climate change? Are solar panels the solution to climate change? And it's like, when is it, if it's a solution, when is it going to be defined as solved? And it's
Mm.
like, okay, like, would you say it's solved when if we get to net zero in 2050, does that mean we've solved climate change? And I think I mentioned as like, well, that's the point where we stop making it worse. We still then have to actually go past net zero to a climate positive system where you start bringing down CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere to get back to where we want to be. And who knows when that's going to happen. So it's like we're not going to know within my daughter's lifetime whether we've solved climate change. We might know if we failed miserably, if there's like a global breakdown and catastrophe that everyone dies. But it's like we won't know if we've solved it. It's going to be centuries of story unraveling of effects and impacts. So, not to put the pressure off of making that change right now, but it's also trying to take that burden off my back of like knowing, trying to think like, are we doing enough? Have we solved it? And saying, okay, let's do the best we can for ourselves right now, which is things that we have to do for the climate progress anyway. But let's celebrate, I know I'm saying it again and again, let's celebrate progress on tighter community structures. Let's go to the Toronto Islands. And, this is like one of the places I love to be able to bring up as a communicator and say, like, we have the largest urban car-free community in North America here in Toronto. And there's a 30-year wait list to get a house there. But it's illegal to have a car-free community anywhere else in the continent. Do we really want a system that bars us from doing that kind of community lifestyle, from living that kind of community lifestyle, if that's also really nice, peaceful place to be that a lot of people would want to be. And there's clearly a strong demand for that kind of lifestyle. Like these are low-hanging fruits that aren't like some crazy technology or require extra mining of minerals. Like they're cheaper, they're close community, they're good for kids, and they're good for the environment. And those are the kind of questions where it's like, let's move away from how often are we flying or how often are we going to eat hamburgers. Let's talk about making a really nice car-free community neighborhood legal. And
Yeah.
those are kind of, I think, lower hanging questions that we could get more progress behind potentially very quickly. And it's just a matter of changing bylaws, really.
Hmm. I really like when you say talking about defining climate change solutions. What came up for me was that it seems like it eventually the Earth is going to re-find some sort of homeostasis with or without us. So it's like it's almost kind of like when and whether we'll be around, which for me is kind of yeah, there's maybe some sort of relief in that it's like, okay, well, maybe like that date just is further out. But I'd still do, I think at some point in the film, one of the climate scientists, they were imagining speaking to, I think, a future generation or a future being. And I think someone at some point said, like, I think they said something about, or maybe this is when they were drawing pictures of like their emotions. And it was like some sort of fear of dark skies and never
Mhm.
seeing like a blue sky or a sunrise again. I kind of like, oh, I think it was like summer is always having like a dark sky. And I'm curious
Yeah.
whether is that like within our lifetime like going to happen based on the data right now? Do you know? Because yeah.
Well, I mean, when I was working for 4 years in Utah when I accepted this position back at the ROM, and it was already getting like that there.
Wow.
It was pretty crazy, like there, and it's not like I knew Utah that long, but I mean, people who grew up there were saying that it was not like that when they were young.
Yeah.
I mean, I used to live in Vancouver, and people were telling me like during those 4 years that Vancouver summers were getting like that too. Like there's just so many forest fires. And like in Utah, it didn't really matter. One couple weeks, it might be a mega fire in California, and then it was one in BC, and then it was one in Colorado, then it was in New Mexico. It was like kind of all across the West. There were just so many fires that it almost didn't matter which way the wind blew. And there would be in the 4 years that I was there, summers were tough because it was like often it was almost like Beijing, like not like Beijing now that they've actually cleaned up the air quality in Beijing. But I feel like what Beijing would have been like maybe in the 90s, when there was more intensive burning of fossil fuels there, where you have like you couldn't see a block or two down the street. You'd wake up with like sore, like red eyes, kind of feeling hungover, and there's nothing you could do. Like you didn't want to go hiking in the mountains because it's like you just want to kind of rest and stay inside and not go out in this like toxic air. And and so that was and I know people were already saying like the Californian dream is dead because there's just so many wildfires that it's like you have these like the summers are miserable. So I that's kind of what I saw that comment coming from in terms of like losing the clear summer skies.
Yeah, not even in the future. It's already happening. Yeah.
Yeah.
Makes me think of I think I'm pretty sure it's a Wet'suwet'en prophecy that it's like when the last glacier melts, like the world will catch on fire.
Hmm.
And I guess
Interesting.
we're kind of seeing that happen.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So I see that we're coming close to our time. And usually we don't want to leave people in this very sad space, but I actually kind of want to invite something that is a thread that I'm definitely seeing, but also in what I'm hearing and what you're saying, maybe even if unintentionally, that there's like in the way that we think about climate change and like reaching these goals, from what I can see, it's like it doesn't, even if we reach those goals, there isn't like a resolution or completion. It's not like, okay, well now it's done, we're saved. This story kind of is ongoing and continues to unfurl or unravel or to build, as you were saying. I think it's like in this time, it's so important to like learn to manage the fear and overwhelm, but to also practice like growing our capacity for non-resolution of being like, okay, like I don't get a tidy bow.
Yeah.
Even if this little project or this like experiment is complete and these are the findings that we have, that doesn't mean conclusively anything.
Yeah.
And I think that we've been fed this lie of resolution growing up, at least for my generation, of like order, of simplicity, that is just not real.
Yeah.
Now we're kind of waking up to be like, oh, okay, this is complex, like it's messy.
Well, and I think that we're also, yeah, I think that's absolutely part of it. It's like this lack of resolution. I don't know if that's going to be like happy for everyone or if that's like depressing for some, but
Mm.
I think that the flip side of that is then focusing on the little gains, the
Yeah.
smaller gains that are around us and celebrating them and trying to put our emotional weight into advancing those and supporting those. Because like these are all things that have to happen along the way too. But let's stop talking about just what's happening at the COP meetings and let's look what's happening in our neighborhood. And
Yeah.
those are equally important in that kind of scale. And when we think about, yeah, like building the communities around those, like this is where you get climate mitigation tying in with climate adaptation and social justice and biodiversity conservation, and all of these things need to kind of come together, and that work has to happen locally. So
Yeah. I know you named that you were a musician and I am too. So I think sometimes we think about like, oh, think about all like the wars that are happening and all the extraction that's happening and the oppression and all the people. But then it's also like, think about like all the people that are singing right now.
yeah,
All the people that are just playing music and many of them doing it for social justice, for these beautiful causes to open the heart and to connect with each other more. Okay, so on that note, what's like one really localized something that is really nourishing you right now? Because yeah, I think it's important to find those things because they're always there. Like our human minds tend towards the negative and to latch onto them and like kind of problematize it larger than it has to be. And then we sometimes overlook the good, right? So why don't we end there?
yeah, we could. I would. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is Beatassaga Park in Toronto. So that the new mouth of the Don River that some people I've heard consider it as the being the largest urban climate adaptation project on the planet, and it's in downtown Toronto, and it's a beautiful naturalized wetland that's been constructed out of the worst, most polluted, dirty oil storage site in the city. And it's a really nice symbol in a lot of ways, I think, of the turnaround that can happen in urban areas when we put our minds to it and our heart to it. And it's so I've been involved with that project the last couple of years, kind of covering it and going to the site and just seeing it transform into this beautiful wetland complex that's just opened this summer. And I mean, that we see already like new fish spawning in there that haven't been in Toronto Harbor, like there's emerald bowfin coming in. There's bald eagles nesting now in Toronto Harbor that haven't ever been observed nesting in the history of the city. You have all this wildlife coming in and populating that space, and that's, I think, a really beautiful sign of the change that can happen for the better.
Oh, that's beautiful. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, of course.
Well, I'm so grateful that we got to share this conversation and debrief a little bit more fully. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Jessica.
Just a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca. We have tons of petitions, other actions and events, and regular news updates you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on the Harbinger Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, YouTube, or wherever else you can get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM, bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe so you can get the latest episodes from us.